My name is Pat Stack and I'm a member of RS21 and myself and Emily will be jointly chairing this afternoon's session, the final session here. There's a couple of announcements that I want to make just before we begin. One is that there is, if everybody could fill in, just so we have contacts and so on, we can maintain contact with you. At the end of the main session, there is a party tonight, an after event.
Why is there such a big
I don't quite know where to hold this. There is an after event, and on your programme, it tells you that it's at the Fitzrovia pub. It's actually at the Fitzrovia Tavern. That's important because there is also a Fitzrovia pub. But the post's important because there is also a Fitzrovia pub. But the postcode is correct and it's on Good Street, so if you wander along, you should all be able to get there. And as long as the person that's leading is followed and doesn't go to the Fitzrovia pub, everything should be fine. This session now on social reproduction, the global women's strike and the future of revolutionary theory. I'm delighted to say we have three speakers, or two speakers and one person who's going to be also part of the question and answer session. We've got Tithi Bhattacharya, who I'm sure already know or will have read, and who's the organiser of the Women's International Strike in the United States. I'm delighted to welcome, slightly again different to the programme, Siggie Vertommen, who is here from the who's here from the Women's Strike Assembly, who's here from the Women's Strike Assembly, as is Ida Calco. Ida, right. So I'm concentrating getting the last bit right and got the first bit wrong. There you go. Who's also from the Women's Strike Assembly, and I really want to thank both of them because they jump in at the last minute to help out here today. So I'm going to ask Siggie to start. Each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes.
Do I need a mic? Because it seems the mic is problematic. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Siggie. I know everybody hoped to see Camille Vertommen, who is, and she said she has a chest infection. I was already I had a first glass of wine, and I said yes to replace her, which looking at the audience maybe wasn't the best idea, but she actually worked hard to prepare a text. I know we actually thought together on writing and putting this text together, so I'm just going to read her text. I know that, so here goes. So the text has been collectively thought with comrades in numerous political spaces, from the Women's Strike Assembly to the Feminist Anti-fascist Assembly to Decrim Now and Plan C. The women's strike in Britain began with women coming together to explore our visions of the red feminist horizon, what it could look like and how crucially, how we could get there. The argument that I want to make today is that the women's strike is not a one-day event set to coincide with International Women's Day each year. It's not an activist campaign or a woman's project. In Europe and across the world, we are witnessing the emergence of an international movement that is experimenting with and struggling for a feminist future. In the last few years, we have fought back and we have won. Let's just take a moment to acknowledge that this year we have won abortion rights in Ireland. We have fought tooth and nail across the Americas from the rights in Ireland. We have fought tooth and nail across the Americas, from the US Supreme Court nominations of sexual abusers to abortion rights in Argentina and against fascist candidates and movements in Brazil and the UK. We are not the first generation, nor will we be the last, to know that women's liberation must be central to all stories. We are not asking for our fair share under capitalism. We have zero desire for an equality that promises nothing more than being equal to a wage slave. Instead, we are seeking to destroy altogether the system that by its very design divides, harms, and exploits us. We already know that in moving towards a red feminist horizon, we continue the work of our feminist mothers and grandmothers in destabilizing ideas of womanhood. We refuse to be divided into good and bad women. We are not interested in reproducing a version of feminism that only makes some women visible, namely those who are white, middle class, cisgender and heterosexual, nor is there anything stable, inherent or natural about being a woman. As Chandra Mohanty so forcefully argued 35 years ago, the relationship between woman, with capital letter, a cultural and ideological construction, and women who are real material subjects, of our collective histories is one of the most central questions that feminism seeks to act upon. Each time we strike, each time we assemble, each time we take to the streets, we confront the reactionary and patriarchal ideas of what it means to be a woman today. We confront the reactionary and patriarchal ideas of what it means to be a woman today. Like that we are still considered naturally caring, that we all want to be mothers, especially good mothers, and that most of the time we are asking for it and the rest of the time we are in need of protection. Our struggles demand the revaluation and redistribution of care work and emotional labor. It sounds complicated, but it really boils down to more people who are not working class women getting involved in the immense amount of work that keeps everyone alive, every single day. It doesn't mean hiring a cleaner so your partner finally stops whining and complaining. We urgently need to respect and in which they are listened to as people, and one that wouldn't dream of putting kids in solitary confinement at privatized state high schools or concentration camps in the desert. We need urgent support for people who care for children, and we desperately need a plan to take care for and offer dignified lives to the older members of our community. It is that as a matter of local, national and international urgency, we must combat the structural and systemic forms of violence and exploitation that harm so many women. Let us also be clear that reducing what it means to be a woman to a set of biological characteristics and reproductive capacities and the result of having a certain genital configuration is a specific form of reactionary politics that we have no interest in. From decades of black feminist history, we have learned that universalist claims of what it means to be a woman serve the interests of some women at the expense of others. Such claims actively work against and solidarity being forged between members of the working class who experience womanhood in different ways. As such, we are no longer interested in the faux debates of whether sex work is real work, if the women's strike is a real strike, whether the millions of hours we spent caring and cleaning produces real value, or if trans women are real women. This is annoying. Can I just shout, or is it not going to be possible? Can people hear me if I speak like this? Sorry? Okay. Sorry? Okay. And if trans women are real women. Attempts to undermine the strength of this movement and thump the table about authenticity say far more about those that seek to reduce women to our biological functions and confine us into victimhood. Produced by black feminism, trans feminism and sex worker rights movements, we know who our sisters are. We know that women of color, trans women and sex workers have a central role to play in dismantling the capitalist patriarchal systems of power that oppress us all. We began the women's strike as we intend to proceed. On the morning of the 8th, over 1,000 people assembled for over 4 hours in central London, arriving from our university picket lines in their hundreds and walking out their offices, homes and factories. A social reproduction collective of mainly men organized collective childcare and cooked food to feed the whole assembly. We stood in solidarity with our Kurdish sisters, cooked food to feed the whole assembly. We stood in solidarity with our Kurdish sisters, making it clear that we will defend the revolution in Rojava because their liberation is bound up with ours. Later on, we picketed pro-life religious organizations and joined striking cleaners who occupied Topshop to highlight their disgusting treatment of their workers. In the evening, we took over the streets of Soho and marched with sex workers who were on strike for the decriminalization of all forms of sex work. We heard from migrant sex workers who were arrested and humiliated during so-called anti-trafficking raids, sex workers who were arrested and humiliated during so-called anti-trafficking raids that did nothing for women in the sex industry and everything for property developers. We listened to strippers who are denied basic employment rights. Our evening ended with hundreds of comrades, including sex workers and trans activists, joining the picture house workers who have been striking and protesting.
Where is that?
Ah, it's maybe that one, yeah. Okay. Picture house workers who have been stressing for over a year to demand a living wage and decent working conditions. On March 8 this year, we exceeded the narrow categories of womanhood forced upon us, and we kept our promise to make feminism a threat again. Returning to the idea that the women's strike is not an event, but instead a process, I want to briefly outline the Women's Strikes Assembly industrial and political strategy for the sex industry and the establishment of Decrim Now, the national campaign for sex workers' rights that is demanding and will win the decriminalization of sex work and what is leading the discussion about sex, violence, and sex workers' rights. In the Me Too era, it's crucial that we talk from both forms of reproductive work, both waged and unwaged. Specifically, we have to be attentive to the discomfort of thinking about sex work even when we don't get paid. Beginning this June, drive of workers across Britain's sex industry with the grassroots union United Voices of the World. Because of how current laws and policies criminalize many aspects of sex work, the unionization campaign is currently focused on organizing strippers and dancers in clubs and pubs. Unionization is the only way with the dignity and respect that we all deserve. We want to unionize the sex industry because we want to build collective power. We are not interested in passing judgment of what type of work people do. We recognize that many women, men, and trans people have a diverse range of experiences in the sex industry, good, bad, and ugly. The current laws that regulate what workers can and can't do with our bodies and the continued efforts to criminalize our workplaces make it difficult, at times nearly impossible, for workers to organize and unionize. One of the main reasons is that we are not considered to be workers. One of the main reasons is that we are not considered to be workers. At best, we are classified as self-employed, and as such, we have very few labor rights, but most of the time we are treated as victims in need of saving and rescue. For the last decade, national governments and local authorities as a cover to create a hostile environment for migrants in the sex industry. Raids on premises, closure of clubs, arrests and deportations have done next to nothing to address instances of forced and coerced labor in the sex industry. Instead, bosses now have even more power and migrant workers have been forced underground and into more dangerous and predation of the sex industry. Unionization will only get us so far. We need to demand the full decriminalization of sex work and changes to the policies regarding sex entertainment venues. We need a union at work, and we need to change national legislation that affects our work. The reason that we need to do both at the same time is to ensure that the bosses. Decriminalization without unionization means that workers will bear the full force of the market and changes will be in the interest of bosses. For too long, a reactionary and conservative vision of women's rights has dominated feminism, especially in relation to the question of sex work and a sex worker's right. Many feminists have been more of sex work and a sex worker's right. Many feminists have been more than happy to allow the police and migration officials to do their dirty work in trying to abolish the sex industry. While at the same time, corporate and so-called radical feminists have had very little to say about the changes to social security benefits, introduction to zero-hour contracts, and the housing crisis, all of which have ensured a steady stream of people looking for work in the sex industry. When we talk about the Red Feminist Horizon, we are sketching out the kind of feminist future that we want and, crucially, how to get there. The Red Feminist Horizon demands that we have a full and fine to and with our bodies. The strategy that I have outlined, which involves the unionization of feminized workforces, plus public and national campaigns aimed at the nation state and policy, alongside feminist education and consciousness raising, is not only relevant for the sex industry. Think of the question of childcare. Think of the question of childcare. Currently, the childcare workforce is ununionized and around 97% of its workers are women. The cost of childcare in Britain are some of the highest in Europe, and the question of who does what reproductive work in the home remains central to the gendered division of labor. In thinking with the Red Feminist central to the gendered division of labor. In thinking with the Red Feminist Horizon, the task is to conceptualize how an international women's movement can organize antagonistic It's the Russians, it's the Russians. It's the Russians, it's the Russians. Organize antagonistic and militant struggles within the terrain of reproduction. I want to just end with a few final comments of what is at stake politically in transforming politics of struggle, by which I mean the conflicts and struggle over what it means to produce and reproduce not only labor power and the wage relation, but life itself. Without a doubt, we have witnessed a turn to the question of social reproduction across significant groups of the radical left. However, despite this care, and if you're lucky, there might be a plate of food at the evening meeting. The point here is that there is a lot at stake when the feminist intervention is packaged up, separated from real politics, and politely understood as care. You know, the good feeling, the feel-good moment of being able to actually have childcare, mental health, the feel-good moment of being able to actually have childcare, mental health support, or to have even thought of questions of accessibility. We need to be very clear that these are not women's concerns. Of course, they are the concerns of many women, but the social reproductive base that enables all politics to even take place is non-negotiable. It enables all politics to even take place is non-negotiable. It is our ground zero. A number of years ago, Silvia Federici was at a meeting and there was a real anger in her voice as she recalled her frustration that we wanted so much more than fucking creches. A similar wave of frustration occurred recently as we watched months of organizing work. A similar wave of frustration occurred recently as we watched months of organizing work by hundreds of women and non-binary people across the country, brave, courageous work of building a feminist anti-fascist mobilization, taking risks, pushing on the boundaries of what could and couldn't happen, one that explicitly set out to confront and disrupt the by offering a feminist analysis of sexual and racial violence, and materially by blocking them in the streets. We watched our organizing efforts and moderate success on the day disappear, literally vanish in both in the mainstream media accounts and also by organizations like Stand Up to Racism and the SWP. Everyone can see that of what is structurally made invisible and devalued was literally made invisible. It's like a feminist joke that keeps on giving. Much like the joke of some men in the left expressing concern about our safety in leading the anti-fascist demo, as if we were safe the rest of our lives, or that's now caught our attention. In recent years, we have been witnessing militant action and the politics of reproduction we have been witnessing militant action in our strikes, in our action, and in our assemblies. During the last summer, the Women's Strike Assembly began calling assemblies on the issue of violence, asking ourselves two questions. What violence means and looks like in our everyday lives and struggles, and two, what an anti-racist, anti-fascist feminist movement would need to look like. And so many women came and shared their experiences of rape, sexual harassment, of racism, of transphobia, and equally our sexual harassment, of racism, of transphobia, and equally our frustrations of both anti-fascist organizing that has failed to adequately confront the question of misogyny and sexual violence, but also at feminist movements that have been unable to connect to the tidal wave of the Me Too anger and to experiences of working class women who have been ignored, neglected, and dismissed because they don't fit neatly into the respectable victim narratives. One of the striking insights to take away from these first 2 tentative months of feminist anti-fascist organizing is that we have been able to link together so many different women's struggles, from Kurdistan to Brazil, to the deindustrialized North, to our trans sisters' right for dignity and liberation. A week after we blocked the fascists, 8,000 women went on strike in Glasgow, and you know what? It feels like the same fight, because it is. This is precisely what the Red Feminist Horizon demands, that our fight against fascism, much like our fight against the endemic horizon demands, that our fight against fascism, much like our fight against the endemic nature of sexual violence or our struggle to halt the currently unfolding ecological collapse, must put women, our lives and our labor at the center of understanding crisis and also at the center of what it means to win. There is much to be done, and one would have to be an urgency of our current political moment. But the forces of rebellion and counterpower are growing and doing the work of building the links between different struggles, and it should come to no fucking surprise that in country after country, it's the feminist movement that is leading the struggles. Because now you have touched the women, you have struck a rock. Thank you.
So now over to Tithi.
Jonas, can you hear?
Okay. Jonas, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, I want to first thank the comrades in RS21, in particular Ruth and Dave and Kate and everyone for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'm very, very happy to be at a conference that actually has crashed the richest of academic conferences, which have the best conferences in America in the most poshest of hotels do not provide fresh for conferences. Poshest of hotels do not provide fresh for conference attendees. So here's a round of applause for RS21 to put it together. Also wonderful to be in a room where we are talking about feminism, to be punctuated with the actually trying to have for being here.
Thank you. And maybe it would also be useful to have a silent applause, because otherwise you will trip every night.
It is really, really important that we call this conference. I thought it was an amazing name to call it the Revenge of Everyday Life, and to put people who were involved in the women's strike at the last session, because we've heard in the entire day of the ruins, that capitalism had tried to do in our life. So this is the revenge that we're going to talk about of how we get the motherfuckers this time around. So this is what we're talking about. So I think if we didn't disturb the comrade who is younger than 18 years, I would say a round of applause for the Google walkouts, a round of applause for the Glasgow strikers, because this is actually Me Too coming into the workplace, in becoming from a Me Too to a We Too movement. So about how the women's strike organizing got started in 2017, and what little I know about it in a global perspective. So in the spring of 2018, Facebook CEO this year, Sheryl Sandberg satisfied until we reach that goal, unquote. A leading exponent of corporate feminism, Sandberg had already made a name and a buck for herself by urging women managers to lean in at company boardrooms. As former Chief of Staff to U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, the man who deregulated Wall Street, she had no qualms about counseling women that success won through toughness in the business world was the royal road to gender equality. This is the same spring a militant feminist strike shut down Spain. A militant feminist strike shut down Spain. Joined by more than 5 million marchers, organizers of the 24-hour Huelga Feminista called for a society free of sexist oppression, exploitation, and violence, for rebellion and a struggle against the alliance of patriarchy patriarchy, for rebellion and a struggle against the alliance of patriarchy and capitalism that wants us to be obedient, submissive, and quiet. As the sun set over Madrid and Barcelona, Catalan and Spanish feminists announced to the world on March 8th, we cross arms interrupting all productive activity, declaring that we will not accept worse working conditions nor being paid less than men for the same work. Unquote. These two voices, Sandberg and the feminist strikers, represent opposing parts for the feminist movement. As a handmaiden of capitalism, they want a world where the task of managing exploitation in the workplace and oppression in the social whole is shared equally by ruling class men and women. This is a remarkable vision of equal opportunity domination. One that asks ordinary people in the name of feminism to be grateful that it is a woman, not a man, who busts their union, orders a drone to kill their parent, or locks their child in a cage at the border. In sharp contrast to Sandberg's liberal feminism, the organizers of the feminist strike insisted on ending capitalism, the system that generates the boss, produces national borders, and manufactures the drones that guard them. Faced with these two visions of feminism, we find ourselves consequences for humankind. One path leads to a scorched planet where human life is immiserated to the point of unrecognizability, if it indeed remains possible at all. The other points to the sort of world that has always figured centrally in humanity's most exalted dreams, a just world whose wealth and natural resources are shared by all, and where equality and freedom are premises, not aspirations. The contrast could not be starker, but what makes the choice pressing for us now is the absence of any viable middle way. We owe the dearth of alternatives to neoliberalism, the exceptionally predatory form of capitalism that has held sway across the globe for the last 40 years. Having poisoned the atmosphere, brought social capacities to the breaking point, and worsened living conditions generally for the vast majority, this capitalism has raised the stakes for every social struggle, transforming sober efforts to win modest reforms into pitched battles for survival. Is past, and feminists must take a stand. Will we continue to pursue equal opportunity domination while the planet burns? Or will we reimagine gender justice in an anti-capitalist form, one that leads beyond the present crisis? This anti-capitalist, in part because of the credibility of political elites collapsing worldwide. The casualties include not only the center-left and center-right parties that promoted neoliberalism, now are despised remnants of their former selves, but also their Sandberg-style corporate feminist selves, but also their Sandberg-style corporate feminist allies, whose progressive veneer has lost its shines. And Hillary Clinton's defeat in the US elections is a very, very prominent example of how lean just didn't work with the vast majority of people in the United States. What gives us now the courage to embark on this project of talking about an anti-capitalist feminism as well as acting as an anti-capitalist feminism is the new wave of militant feminist activism. Siggie's talked about it. What gives us hope are the international feminist and women's strikes of 2017 and 18. It is in these strikes and the increasingly coordinated movements that are developing around them that we have called in the US a feminism for the 99%. The recent feminist strike movement began in Poland in October of 2016, when more than 100,000 women staged walkouts and marches to oppose that country's ban on abortion. By the end of the month, an refusal had already crossed the ocean to Argentina, where striking women met the heinous murder of Lucia Perez with the militant cry, "Ni una menos," not one more. Soon it spread to Italy, Spain, Brazil, Turkey, Peru, the United States, Mexico, Chile, and a dozen other countries. The United States, Mexico, Chile, and a dozen other countries. From its origin in the streets, the movement then surged through workplaces and schools, eventually engulfing the high-flying worlds of show business, media, and politics. For the last 2 years, its slogans have resonated powerfully. Across the globe. Nosotras paramos, we strike, vivas nos corremos, ni una menos, time's up, and of course feminism for the 99. At first a ripple and then a wave, it has now become a massive tide as a global anti-capitalist feminist consciousness. What had been a series of nationally based actions became a transnational movement on March 8, 2017, when organizers around the globe decided to strike together. With this bold stroke, purely depoliticized through the 40 years of neoliberalism into sort of sending cards to your women friends and drinking mimosas in the morning and lunches. So 2017 March 8th was more Clarisetian than mimosa. So that was sort of the comeback of this movement. This movement has invented new ways to strike and infused the strike form itself with a new kind of politics. By coupling the withdrawal of labor with marches, demonstrations, business closures, and boycotts, the movement is replenishing the repertoire of boycotts. The movement is replenishing the repertoire of strike actions, once large but dramatically shrunk by a decades-long neoliberal offensive. At the same time, this new wave is democratizing strikes and expanding their scope, above all by broadening the very idea of what counts as labor or work. Refusing to limit that category to wage work, women's strike activism is also withdrawing housework, sex, and smiles. By making visible the indispensable role played by a gendered unpaid work in capitalist society, it valorizes activities from which capital benefits, but for which it does not pay. And with respect to paid work too, the strikers take an expansive view of what counts as a labor issue, also targeting sexual harassment and assault. If you see the McDonald's strikes, barriers to reproductive justice, and curbs on the right to strike itself. As a result, the new feminist wave has the potential to overcome the stubborn and divisive opposition between identity politics and class politics. Disclosing the unity of workplace and private life, it refuses to limit class struggle to one of those spaces. And by redefining what counts as work and who counts as a worker, it rejects capitalism's structural undervaluation of women's labor, both paid and unpaid. All told, women's strike feminism anticipates the possibility of a new, unprecedented phase of class struggle, feminist, international. This intervention could not have come at a better time. Women's strike militancy has erupted at a moment when once powerful trade unions have been severely weakened. To reinvigorate class struggle, activists have turned to another arena, the neoliberal assault on healthcare, education, pensions, and housing, and some of which we heard in the morning sessions. In targeting this other prong of capital's attack on working class living conditions, they have trained their sights on the labor and services that are needed to sustain human beings, and social communities. It is here, in the sphere of social reproduction, that we now find some of the most militant strikes and fightbacks, from the strike wave of teachers in the United States to the struggle against water privatization in the United States, to the struggle against water privatization in Ireland, to the strikes of Dalit sanitation workers in India, all led and powered by women, workers are revolting against capital's assault on social reproduction. Although not formally affiliated with the international women's strike movement, that is necessary to reproduce our lives while opposing its exploitation. And they too combine wage and workplace demands with demands for increased public spending and on social services. In countries such as Argentina, Spain, and Italy, moreover, women's strike feminism has attracted demonstrations against the defunding of schools, healthcare, housing, transport, and environmental protections. Through their opposition to capital's assault on these public goods, feminist strikes are thus becoming the catalyst and model for broad-based efforts to defend our communities. The new wave of militant feminist activism is rediscovering the idea of the impossible, demanding both bread and roses. The bread that decades of neoliberalism have taken from our tables, but also the beauty that nourishes our spirit through the exhilaration of rebellion. Thank you.
To our speakers. What we're going to do next is break down into smaller groups on your table. If you haven't the opportunity to do so, introduce yourself to one another. This time can be used to kind of share social reproduction, kind of moving forward, but also talk about the resistance towards it and moving forward as well. So about 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Just a couple of announcements. We're probably going to finish around 5 to 5 because there's another event in here and we need to be just at 5. We're going to a different pub.
No, it's the same
pub.
pub,
Okay.
same pub, but the correct name this time.
Okay, so it's actually called for its
Fitzrovia
Bell, not tavern, not pub. Okay, so we're going to have about 10 minutes of Q&A and discussion. We're going to have about 10 minutes of Q&A and discussion with everyone and the speakers, and then we're going to come back to Tithi, Siggie, and Ida. So who'd like to go first?
Right at the back. Right at the back. Right at the back.
All right, Kate, I'm coming.
Shout if you want.
Yeah, shout.
Just in case the mic starts trying to make a speech again. I just thought from, I really enjoyed the two speeches. And I thought that it's a really nice note to end on a kind of positive note about things that have been going on globally. But to take a couple of steps back from that, I think particularly Tithi's speech was drawing a lot of inspiration from the global women's strikes, from the hundreds of thousands on the street in Spain and the big stuff happening in America against Trump, a really great win and a really heartening win. But at the moment it seems to me that the state of the sort of grassroots feminist movement in the UK is kind of split between small groups that are doing really great targeted work, Sisters on the Cot of Domestic Violence, the anti-fascist mobilisation a few years ago, but that hasn't been people all gathering together in a way that has a longer vision for where it's going to go next, or isn't confining itself to a particular set of single issues in each case. And that's something that we have to think about how we go about building. One important question that I think is last year I wanted to strike on March 8th. I didn't have a job at the time, so I refused to do my washing. So that's going to be for the following week. Never mind. But the point I think there is that there are lots of questions that we need a movement to start answering. Like literally how? Is it illegal for me to walk out of workplace? I know it's become illegal with the Trade Union Act 2015 to leave a workplace for reasons that are related to a workplace political, so I think you can't strike. There's probably people who know more about this than me, where you can't strike in solidarity with someone else. there are lots of these like changes and things that have come in with the Trade Union Act first, and also working out where can we go next, basically, from this point. Can we skill each other up on what possibilities are, so we can start looking.
Okay, thanks, Kate. The lady in room.
Why do we have, I'm sorry, I'm going to challenge that. Why do we have, I'm sorry, I'm going to challenge that. Why are you using the term lady? We're in a socialist gathering.
Okay, comrade.
Sister, woman.
Okay.
It's a class term.
I wanted to carry term.
Speak up.
The points that were raised earlier by the sister over here who spoke in the early meeting. The question is there seems to be some difficulty in addition on something that relates deeply to social reproduction. How can single mothers go out? And this is the one I've been wanting to ask you, Tithi, this and Shinsia this for years, because how can they do that? We have to make sure that we and the organizations, their members, can be able to do this without, shall we say, and it's not something that we could throw our labor from. And I really, I've been banging my head and banging my head against the wall on this one, and I was hoping that maybe, when a longer person here, maybe we can start talking about how we can be more inclusive to make sure this happens.
Okay, I saw a couple of hands. I saw Ruth go back to the speakers, okay? So Ruth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something that came up in our discussion at this table, which is the difference between workers' struggle that has an impact on the capitalist economy and the functioning of the economy, that has an impact on the capitalist economy and the functioning of the economy, and workers' struggle that can maybe have more of a broader ideological impact. And it seems that although lots of the kind of most profitable sections of the economy might still be dominated by male workers, lots of women who work in kind of social reproductive areas of the economy, where they've taken action recently, it's been really impressive and it's had a really big impact. So we mentioned with the Glasgow Council workers who were striking for equal pay just the other week, who were everywhere, all over the news, this women's strike for equality. And they were all being interviewed saying, arguing against the council, who was saying, but we've already agreed that we're going to keep our terms. We wanted to be striking because we wanted to be able to our time scale and so on. So we had this amazing image of these powerful, strong women who just wanted to take things into their own hands. That image that was even more effective than any impact that they may have had on social services and the functioning of Glasgow City social services and the functioning of Glasgow City Council, because I don't even know what section they even worked in, but it was a really powerful image.
We talked about one of the things that come up a lot today is for the crisis for capital in producing workers, that actually it isn't doing so. Crisis for capital in producing workers, that actually it isn't doing so well at reproducing itself. And what does that mean for demands that we make? Do we make demands that actually make it easier for capitalism to get on with things? So for example, childcare. Do we make demands for childcare that are about us being able to get to work? Do we make demands for childcare that are about us being able to get to work easier and have someone to look after our kids? Or do we make demands about childcare that are actually better for kids and people as a whole? And that will also relate to education. So at the moment the content of education is very much about getting people work ready or by the employers, whereas we want to make demands for an education that is around the liberation of peoples. And how do we kind of make sure that we don't slip into, because obviously the stresses of our lives are often around us not being good workers, and not having enough childcare and that impacts on us work. So how do we make demands that make life better for people, but then
so I want to respond to Kate's question. Was it Kate first?
Yeah.
I disagree with this idea that there isn't like a kind of big feminist movement in the UK because this was the first year that we did the women's strike. Big feminist movement in the UK because this was the first year that we did the women's strike in the UK. And I'd say we did quite well. And also bearing in mind that the women's strike has been organising for the anti-fascist feminist mobilisation, which was pretty much the most successful anti-fascist mobilisation that London has seen in at least 5 years. So I would say that these, kind of thinking about what we've been doing in the last 6 months is actually quite impressive. And on that note, I wanted to really briefly kind of speak about why the women's strike and why feminist movements are actually pretty much they're the movements currently that are most threatening to capital and also the far right. Big movements, like for example, looking at Italy right now, I've been speaking with some comrades there who said that it's Ninuna di Meno or something, the kind of Italian version of Ninuna Menos is pretty much the most it's the biggest threat to the far right, and some people would say only like real kind of mass movement that can challenge the essentially like fascist government. And I think it's really crucial to think about this like joining point between anti-fascism and feminism, because the ripple effects of that go far wider than let's get women on the streets to tell the fascism back off. Because obviously what's happening around the world is that far-right movements are saying that they just want to protect women, which is the kind of classic idea of from the other. And obviously that's also how the state operates, in that the state uses the same kind of rhetoric in saying, we just want to liberate these poor women abroad and that's why we're going to war. This is the kind of classic experiences can be like distilled into this thing that can be thrown around to say, oh, but we're doing this for the right reasons, we're taking violent action and killing people, but it's all, you feminists should be happy that we're doing this because, we're doing it for the women. Yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up, but basically what the UK is trying to do is really look at violence and how state violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, the commonalities between those and how they target women, and obviously what we can actually do to fight that. And I think that's really the key thing, is that the women's strike movement is growing, and I do think to me it's like the biggest sign of hope on the left right now.
Yeah, I maybe wanted to compliment on what Ida said and invite the invite the comrade in the back for the next meeting of the Women's Strike Assembly. I mean, I just moved to the UK last year, so I don't know all the histories of feminist movements and how they've been dispersed and separated and atomized. It's not as big as in Spain yet, or as in Italy, or as in Argentina and other places. But I mean, we have to start somewhere, and I hope, to see more people at our upcoming meetings. And I wanted to also briefly comment on what the comrade said about single mothers, which I think, fair point, and I think every political organization should, for every of its meetings, of its assemblies, of its conferences, should really take into account the fact that people have other people to take care of. So just speaking of the Women's Strike Assembly, on every of our meetings and assemblies we have childcare and food that's organized. Strike Assembly, on every of our meetings and assemblies we have childcare and food that's organized by mostly cis men. And that's something that we really want to stick to, not as some kind of tokenist, it's taken care of, but as an essential way of what the women's strike is and what feminist organizing should be. So, single women and single moms all have their place and should be. So, single women and single moms all have their place and space in the Women's Strike Assembly. So I hope that's something we really value greatly.
very quickly. So just to start from where Siggie finished off on the single mothers question, and you know, one of the most successful social movements in the US in recent times is the civil rights movements in the post-war era. And the civil rights movement was led by women who were from single mother-headed families. So it can be done, and we can win on that basis, but we have to make that a transformative and central part of left, strategically important in an economy. And I think I want to push back, not to what you said, but I want to push back a little bit on the recent labor sociology that actually privileges logistic workers as the strategic location workers a little bit, because undoubtedly that's a very important sector to organize and obviously gives us the vistas of what is possible. But I also think that when there is a rolling wave of teacher strikes and that actually closes down the state, and people cannot then go to work either because their children are not at school, when there is a rolling wave of nurses to work either because their children are not at school, when there is a rolling wave of nurses strike where hospitals close down, I think that is quite strategically inconvenient for capital. So I think we need to actually challenge that logistic workers are the only sort of weak points of the capitalist social social relations. On the last question, I just want to end with this, that I think one of my lessons in the teacher strike experience that I have I'm not a teacher, not in the public school teacher kind of sense in the US, I do teach. But I've been to several spots of the teacher strikes in this last spring. And you know, when it began in West Virginia and I was there, most of the women that I interviewed talked of the attack, but when they were asked a direct question as to whether they saw this as a gendered attack on women and the kind of work women do, they said, oh no, this has got nothing to do with feminism or gender, this is very much a teacher's issue, it's a wage issue. Most of the women I interviewed said this. Today, you know, the last wave of strike, which is Arizona, and some of the LA teachers who are about to go on strike have emphasized that this is about an attack on us as women as well as teachers. This is a gendered attack on this sector. And I think growing as the strikes enhance the capacities of people and confidence of people, but also I think it is the role of socialists have played in these strikes to connect these issues of feminism not being just a woman's issue, but actually a class issue. And I think as we move forward, those are the connections globally. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Pat Stack and I'm a member of RS21. And myself and Emily will be jointly chairing this afternoon's session, the final session here. There's a couple of announcements that